This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. When President Joe Biden took the oath of office in January of 2021, he had the daunting task of calming a divided nation. We had just witnessed a violent mob attack at the U.S. Capitol, and COVID-19 lockdowns still had no end in sight. We all couldn't wait to get back to normal, so Joe Biden's promise of bringing steady hands back to the Oval Office was reassuring to many Americans. In the first months of his presidency, Biden enjoyed positive approval ratings until a chaotic U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Since August 2021, Biden's been met with declining poll numbers and escalating international violence. The most reported are the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and a Hamas terrorist attack on Israel in October 2023. But there are countless other international challenges Biden's faced in his single term as president. Joe Biden will not seek re-election, so historians are beginning to evaluate his legacy. How will his foreign affairs record be remembered? Joining me now is Dr. Timothy Naftali. Dr. Timothy Naftali is a senior research scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He was recently featured in the magazine Foreign Affairs in What Biden's Exit Means for American Foreign Policy. It's an excellent theme for an episode as President Biden wraps up his single term as president. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Ray.
For people who haven't read the article yet, and I recommend it, how do you briefly answer your own implicit question? What does Biden's exit mean for American foreign policy?
In the short term, President Biden's decision to step aside sent the best possible signals to American allies and the strongest possible signals to American adversaries. It's really important to keep in mind that leaders of other countries are as sensitive to what goes on in our country as we are. And though they are not part of our political culture, and many of them do not wish us well, because we are a superpower, what happens at home here matters. And so the cataclysmic or seismic domestic consequences of President Biden's very poor performance in the June 27th debate had equally important consequences around the world, because a lot of leaders, who after all are experts in politics and power, recognize that if the Democrats did not change the top of their ticket, they would lose. And so many were beginning to game the system to see what to do in advance of a Trump victory. With President Biden's courageous decision, and we can talk about the timing of it, but when you think about American history, it is incredibly rare for incumbent presidents to decide not to run for a second term. And it is unprecedented for them to do it only weeks before a convention at which they would have been renominated, and because of pressure from their own party. So what we witnessed is one of those events we will remember for years to come and will become one of those parallels we will test future events against. For foreign leaders, their assumption was that Biden was done and that the Democrats were done. And so we already saw some activity on the part of foreign leaders that suggested they were preparing for a Trump victory. And so the consequences of President Biden's stepping aside are already evident and will help shape the next few months, if not the next 4 years.
During his announcement that he was leaving the job, one thing President Biden said he wanted to devote his attention to was stopping the fighting in Israel and Gaza. Does he have a shot? There are several months left until the end of his term, but some days it looks like the war in that region is widening, not calming down.
I want to make a quick reference to a parallel. when Lyndon Johnson opted not to run again, and he could have, and he would have been his party's nominee. Whether he would have won again or not is a different question. In 1968, he twinned his decision to step aside with a new commitment to achieving some kind of diplomatic settlement in the Vietnam War. He understood that his future legacy would in part be determined by how the Vietnam War ended. He had an amount of power to do that Joe Biden doesn't have, because the United States was a direct combatant in the Vietnam War. The United States could have and had the power to negotiate a ceasefire at any point. Indeed, Lyndon Johnson unilaterally called a bombing halt. Well, when you're a combatant, you can do that. Well, the United States is not a combatant in the Israel-Gaza war. The United States has to use the leverage that one has because one of the combatants is an ally. But if that ally isn't going to listen, how do you impose this on the ally? So I think that the challenge for the Biden administration, and it's been true throughout this war, is trying to convince the Israelis that they are on a path to destruction, not of the state of Israel, but in a sense, destruction of their international reputation and the destruction of an acceptable living standard for civilians in Gaza. And the United States, I am sure we'll learn this because not all the materials obviously are open, but we will learn that the U.S. has put pressure on Israel to minimize the number of civilian casualties. I'm sure we will find that the United States has put pressure on Israel to work harder to get the hostages released. And we've succeeded to an extent we don't really know, but we certainly haven't vastly succeeded. Will Joe Biden be more successful? Well, that may have to do with whether Netanyahu thinks that Trump or Harris will be elected. Because remember that Netanyahu is no friend of Joe Biden's, even though Joe Biden has been a great friend of Israel's. And I would suspect that Netanyahu would much prefer Donald Trump to be elected in November. So one of the factors in this story is the extent to which the Israeli government is going to play politics to undermine any attempt that Joe Biden makes to improve his legacy in the Middle East. I suspect Joe Biden will not have a partner in Netanyahu, and therefore I worry that the Israeli government, not the Israeli people, but the Israeli government may actually want to embarrass Joe Biden in the last months of his term.
Joe Biden, whatever his strengths and weaknesses may have been, was a product of another era, of a guy who had a zest for the junkets, was well-traveled, a familiar face in foreign capitals, a frequent visitor to the trouble spots of the world. Vice President Harris spent a lot of time in foreign capitals since 2021. We're still learning about her. We're still finding out about her conviction points. Is there much daylight, do we know yet, between President Biden and the woman who is now almost certainly the Democrats' next standard bearer?
Vice President Harris did her job very well, which means we don't know if there's any daylight between her and the president. The job of the vice president is to shore up, strengthen, amplify, and repeat the president of the United States' approach in foreign policy. If you know of daylight between them, then the vice president has failed in her job. So the fact that we don't know is just a sign of her professionalism. What we are seeing is a slight change in emphasis, in nuance. Vice President Harris has spent some more time talking about the humanitarian consequences of Gaza. Not that President Biden didn't talk about them, but for President Biden, Israel was to some extent, he's not a naive man, but was to some extent still the Israel of Golda Meir, the Israel of the 70s, the Israel of kibbutzim and survivors of the Holocaust. And Israel, actually, to put it in one phrase, the underdog Israel was the Israel he remembered. And obviously, Netanyahu's Israel, at least the power elite, is different. So Vice President Harris, in making a point of not going to Netanyahu's speech, something she would, to put it this way, if she weren't in a campaign, something she would have done, I suspect, but not going to the speech, emphasizing, I think, in a very helpful way, the humanitarian consequences of Israel's approach to counterterrorism. She is not creating daylight, but adding nuance. In terms of Ukraine, no difference at all. In terms of China, well, we don't know yet, but she was focusing on aspects of the Chinese challenge which are not going to change. Vice President Harris was used by the Biden administration in East and Southeast Asia to send this signal that we are sensitive to the consequences of our friends in that region of Chinese imperialism. I don't suspect that will change.
When I was thinking about this program and thinking back to past inter-party handoffs, from Eisenhower to Kennedy, from Johnson to Nixon, from Ford to Carter to Reagan in a very short run of years, from Clinton to George W. Bush. Sure, a waiting world may have looked on with concern about what was going to change and what was going to stay the same. This has very suddenly become an open seat election, and it's hard to think of two potential presidents with more different outlooks in the modern era of American foreign policy. Eisenhower didn't have to go to the inauguration wondering whether Kennedy was going to stay in NATO. This is a very broadly different choice that Americans have in November. Fair?
Ray, this is a choice that Americans haven't had in 80 years. Who is in the White House will determine the direction of our foreign policy, as the Supreme Court reminded us in Trump versus the United States. And Vice President Harris is an internationalist. There's no doubt about it. The strength of her commitment to it, well, we may discover it might be a little less than President Biden's, but it's still internationalist. Donald Trump, by selecting J.D. Vance, has made it clear he doesn't want a debate among Republicans about this country's role in the world. He doesn't want one anymore. He didn't like the fact that many of his appointees actually were trying to be the adults in the room to try to keep him as close to internationalism as possible. He didn't like that at all. He complained bitterly, fired most of them. So if he were to return for a second term, one should expect a much more self-centered, isolationist America. And that would mean the kind of government we haven't had since the 1920s.
Well, one person I think we can stipulate is watching all of this really closely is Volodymyr Zelensky. He was scrambling after the June presidential debate as voices inside Ukraine were now more frequently speculating about a Trump victory. The Ukrainian president even started to talk publicly about alternative paths to the end of the war. What could this election mean for him and for his people?
What this would mean, should Donald Trump return to the White House, is that Vladimir Putin would know that we wouldn't respond to additional pressures against Ukraine. And the Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky, would unfortunately have to conclude that we could not be counted on to assist Ukraine were the situation to deteriorate rapidly, and that he would have to rely on European powers, which have a very hard time balancing their own security needs with the extra amount of assistance that the Ukrainian army would need to hold off a Russian offensive.
One thing that both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have said publicly is that the Europeans have been slack in their support for Ukraine and allowed the United States to carry the burden. It's not true. In both kind and in, fighting spirit, the Europeans have been there really in a very impressive way and taken 4 million Ukrainian refugees. They've definitely got skin in the game. But it sounds like you're saying they wouldn't be able to go on alone if the U.S. pulled out.
To Ukraine, if the Russians continue their World War I strategy of winning through attrition, if you look at the nature of the war in Ukraine, we saw a Russia that was prepared for a war that wasn't going to happen. It assumed a quick victory. The decapitation strategy in 2022 would work. When it turned out they actually had to fight a real Ukrainian army, they collapsed, and the Ukrainians made heavy gains. Then the fronts, because there's more than one, stabilized. And the assumption and the hope, I think, on the side of the free world was that you just build up the Ukrainians and then you have a nice push and that'll be it. But it didn't happen because when you're involved in war, the other side learns too, which means it's now a grinding, very costly war. And that's the situation that we face. I would argue that one of the mistakes that we have made, we the allies of Ukraine have made, is that it's not a mistake politically because we are democracies and it's a beautiful thing and it's what we're all fighting to continue. But because we are democracies and because the Europeans had to do things they had not been willing to do before, a lot of our debate about what to do for Ukraine has been very public. And so the Russians have been able to prepare for all kinds of weapon systems because we had to break precedents, and particularly the Europeans. The idea of sending F-16s, well, that's been in the air for a year and a half. So the Russians already have a counter F-16 doctrine ready. They've started bombing Ukrainian air bases, ready for that moment because it took time and it was all done publicly. And the other problem, I think, is that we have sometimes deterred ourselves because we've been fearful of escalation. And because the Russian team that's there, they're all products of the Cold War. They all went to the same school. It's a school of scare the Americans because the Americans are stronger than we are, but we can scare them. And when we scare them, they don't use their power. I don't mean by launching an attack, but we get scared. And, understandably, we should be sensitive to nuclear danger. Putin has played on our fears of nuclear war. And by the way, when I say our, I don't just mean Washington's. I mean Germany's. There are a number of countries that share this fear. And for that reason, we have taken a while to give certain weapon systems to the Ukrainians that in the end did not escalate the war and have proven useful.
Earlier this year on Shifting Ground, we did a program talking about why Americans generally don't vote on foreign policy matters unless the United States has soldiers in the field who are in active hostilities. Problems on the other side of the planet don't drive voters to the polls. And at the same time, there's a lot going on in this complicated world of ours that the United States is involved in up to its eye teeth that could really be critically different depending on who's standing on the west front of the Capitol next January taking the oath of office, whether it's continued membership of NATO, how the Israel-Hamas war gets at least to a ceasefire, whether or not the United States continues to try to blow oxygen into the lungs of the Iranian nuclear deal. I don't know how much, given that voters aren't paying rapt attention, a President Trump would feel compelled to do once he became president. Is this partially just theatrics to get through the front door of the White House again?
It's a great question, Ray. And the answer has a lot to do with how Donald Trump thinks about legacy. Donald Trump himself will not be under any pressure of reelection. He will be an immediate lame duck once he's elected, which is, by the way, always the problem of a second-term president. In his case, he will be the first president since Grover Cleveland to have a second term with a 4-year interval in between. I think one of the key puzzles for observers of the Trump-Vance team is what does J.D. Vance believe in? Which J.D. Vance will turn up around the White House? Will it be the J.D. Vance of Yale Law School or the years thereafter, who might not have been such a vicious opponent of America and the world? Or will it be this new form of J.D. Vance, designed very carefully in order to gain power next to Donald Trump? We'll see. This is one of the challenges when dealing with a political opportunist. One never knows how that person will define opportunity. In the case of Donald Trump, we can expect him to be angry and to growl and to make life difficult for American allies, as he did in the first term. But will he be effectively petulant in terms of his approach to the world if his advisors argue effectively that this is not a crisis that we need at this point? We will see. Trump, if he's reelected, once Trump ends his term in 2029, what, if any, medium to long-term changes does he really care about? I think that's the big question. And the second question is, to what extent are Americans, left and right, rethinking the world? Because the Republicans are not the only tribe in American political life who are beginning to ask questions about America's role in the world. So I think we could be seeing a generational change in how Americans think about the world. So regardless of what Donald Trump cares about his legacy, we may see a shift towards much less internationalism because of a general change in public opinion in this country.
It is, on one level, kind of remarkable that I can sit with an international scholar in 2024 and be speculating about the future, for instance, of NATO. But here we are. I ran into a friend who has a son in service, and we were in a store together, and I asked how the son was. She mentioned he was headed to Finland. And this is something new, to have American troops doing NATO exercises right on the frontier of the old Soviet borders, right next to Russia in Finland. It is in many ways a new world, a complicated world. Does it have to be a scary world?
I'm afraid look, human nature doesn't change. And greedy, power-hungry people are produced around the world all the time. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it's just not human nature to solve our foreign policy problems all at once, but we can manage them. We lived through a, a remarkable period in history when we saw an empire collapse almost without violence. There was some violence, but for the most part, it was a peaceful transition. That happens rarely in world history, and it may have given us a sense that's the way that things go. But as we're seeing with Putin, in a sense, Putin has revived the whole project of Moscow imperialism. He's revived it and has shown us the deep resentment that many Russians had in 1991. But fortunately, thanks, I think, to two men, Gorbachev and Yeltsin, did not ultimately define Russia's immediate response to losing that power. We're seeing it now. I think what should be the lesson of the last century is that with the world always going to have bad people, I'm talking about leaders, it is in the interests of democracies to stay strong. We should never allow ourselves to slip back into the situation we were in the 1920s and 30s. Countries look to us because of our economic power, but we really couldn't and didn't play a role in stabilizing the system before it fell apart. I mean, that's the issue, really. It's not that you prepare for D-Day Normandy. That's the failure. I mean, that's a great success, but the fact is you don't want to get to that point where the only way you can restore a continent's ability to express itself democratically is to go in with, 1 million soldiers. That, to me, is the system has been fallen apart. You want to be managing, if you will, doing gardening for years and years, but that takes generational commitments. And one of the challenges, I think, I wouldn't say the Biden generation, that generation has done all it can for us, and we should be grateful to it. But for the younger generation, slightly younger generation, is to try to share the reasons why, even with the end of the Soviet Union, that America could and can and should play a role in the world. And even though at times the country will cross certain lines for certain individuals, it doesn't mean that the whole project is immoral. That in fact, the project is beneficial, even though some expressions of American power at certain times have been disgusting. And it's understanding that complexity. It's often nuanced. And if that can be explained through the study of our history, through shared experience, through the experiences that our military has had actually in humanitarian efforts and in efforts to stabilize countries, if those can be shared more widely, then I think Americans can make informed choices about how to help stabilize the world without violating their internal ethical systems.
Timothy Naftali, he's a senior research scholar at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray. It's been my pleasure.
Biden has officially endorsed Kamala Harris for the 2024 presidential election, and during the Democratic National Convention in a couple of weeks, the vice president is poised to become officially her party's nominee. On Monday, August 12th, a week before the DNC, I'll be live in San Francisco for a special convention preview with the Lincoln Project's Stuart Stevens. You can buy tickets at commonwealthclub.org. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.